Hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our event today, Invisible Migrants and the Sea in Between. So this event is part of our Third Thursday series, which is a graduate student initiative from the Spanish and Portuguese department to invite different speakers and scholars and artists to dialogue with our department's faculty and to create a community around our interdisciplinary and research interests. So today we have three amazing speakers. I'm going to read their biographies to introduce them to you. So we have Andrew Rebatta here. So Andrew has worked on exhibitions at community-based museums in New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. He is the assistant curator at the Museum of Chinese in America and curated Fold Golden Venture Paper Sculptures, which is currently on view and features artwork created by detained Chinese asylum seekers. Andrew was on the curatorial team for Sour, Sweet, Bitter, Spicy, Stories of Chinese Food and Identity in America, as well as the upcoming exhibition, Chinese Medicine in America, Converging Ideas, People, and Practices. Prior to coming to MoCA, Andrew worked for the Smithsonian Latino Center, Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum, and the National Museum of Mexican Art. In 2011, he was curator in residence at the Museo Experimental El Eco in Mexico City, and in 2013 and 2014, he organized exhibitions and performances for the New Forms Media Society in Vancouver, BC. So welcome, Andrew. We also have James D. Fernández from our department. So James D. Fernández, professor in our department, is also co-director of the project Ni Frailes ni Conquistadores, Spanish Immigrants in the United States, 1868 to 1945. Together with the Spanish journalist and filmmaker Luis Argeo, Fernández has, for the last 10 years, been crisscrossing the United States and Spain, interviewing descendants of Spanish immigrants and digitizing their family archives. The primary goal of this fieldwork is to construct a digital archive that will document the history of this little-known chapter of Spanish and U.S. history. Their book of photographs, scanned from family albums, Invisible Immigrants, Spaniards in the U.S., is a progress report on that ongoing archival project. Jim has also worked on documentary projects, Dan Albert's Paella, and A Legacy of Smoke, and The Weight of Remembering. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
We also have J.P. Sniadecki. So JP works between the U.S. and China as a filmmaker and anthropologist. His films are in the permanent collections of the New York Museum of Modern Art and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, distributed through Carnival Cinema Guild and Icarus, and screened at festivals such as the Berlinale Locarno, New York AFBI, BFI London, Edinburgh, Rotterdam, Cinema du Real, and Hong Kong, as well as at the Whitney Biennial, the Shanghai Biennial, the Guggenheim, and the MoMA. His feature films include Demolition, winner of the Joris Ivans Award, Foreign Parts, winner of 2 Leopards at Locarno, People's Park, named Best Anthropological Film at Festival de Popoli, Human, named Best Film at Taiwan IDFF. Sniadecki's 2014 feature, The Iron Ministry, was A.O. Scott's New York Times Critics' Pick, as it garnered prizes at La Alternativa, Ann Arbor, Valdivia, and Camden. And his latest feature, El Mar La Mar, which we'll be speaking about today, earned the Caligari Award at the Berlinale premiere, Da Kosovo, Indi Lisboa, Olhar Cinema, Filmmaker Festival, and Lima Independent. And he currently teaches film practice and theater at Northwestern University, and is a Guggenheim Fellowship recipient. So we welcome all of our guests today. Thank you so much. And so what we'll do is we'll have everyone give a presentation of their work, and afterwards we'll open it up for discussion for the audience. So we can start with Andrew.
How do I control? Great. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about an exhibition that's currently up at the Museum of Chinese America in Chinatown, not too far from here. I guess this talk, or my presentation, will include some information about the curatorial process, but I really want to get into what the exhibition is and maybe at certain points describe my decision-making when I speak about it. And hopefully when there's like a Q&A, there'll be some more questions because I don't know if I can address them. But I'll begin now. This is the title wall for our exhibition. It basically describes the story of the Golden Venture. Does everybody here know a bit about this story? Okay, so I'll just get right into it briefly. Basically, in June 6, 1993, a ship sailed from Bangkok, Thailand, to Kenya, then around the Cape of Good Hope, and arrived here in New York. This was a 3-month journey. Its passengers were primarily Fujianese, which in China is just above like Canton and there. It's like north of there, across from Taiwan. So just, I guess also to tell you is the migrants actually had to get to Bangkok. So even though it was a 3-month journey, for a lot of them, it started much earlier. And once they arrived, they ran aground because there was a mutiny on this ship. There was some issues between the Thai crew, and one of them just ran it aground in Rockaway Beach, in the 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. in the morning. Within a couple of hours, there were Coast Guard helicopters flying above with flashing lights on them. Media started appearing, and basically this became like a huge spectacle. And I remember I was about 13 at the time, seeing this ship on the news with people jumping off of it into the water. These individuals who did jump into the water were told by the Thai crew to do so they can reach the shore and then become deportable and try to carry out their asylum cases. Sadly, for the people who did jump off, about 10 died. They say they drowned, but in reality, they most likely died from cardiac arrest because they were so malnourished when they arrived here, subsisting on maybe a bowl of rice a day. Of the 286 migrants, 21 were women, and there were about, I want to say like a dozen youth on this ship. Within 24 hours of arriving, they were sent to detention centers across the country. The majority of them were sent to a detention center in York, Pennsylvania, which is in central Pennsylvania, which is, if you don't know, a very conservative part of the state. It's also very common for these immigration detention facilities to kind of be in rural, remote areas, not only because it creates jobs, but because it's more difficult for the detainees to find legal representation, people who speak their language, their communities in the area, things like that. But something amazing happened in New York around those. A lot of activism happened around the New York detainees. But other detainees were sent elsewhere. The youth were sent to a center in Michigan, where a lot of them ended up entering the foster care system. The 21 women were sent to a facility in New Orleans, which is also at a prison. And they were actually grouped in with the general prison population. And I'll get into their experiences soon. Others were sent to Virginia, Florida, and other places in the U.S. But for this exhibition, we're going to focus primarily on the York County detention facility because that's where the majority of the detainees were sent, a little over 100. For a lot of the detainees who were also apprehended that day, they decided to just have themselves deported immediately. So when you do see some images of the detainees at York and the ones who stayed in the U.S., they're generally on the younger side. It was the older migrants who wanted to get back home because I think they had families that they didn't take care of. And they were expecting to enter into indentured servitude upon arrival so they can send that money home to support them. And this is the title wall, which kind of has that. So if any of you ever want to visit the museum, I'm totally down to give you a tour. So initially with this project kind of began in 1996 at the museum, actually. The migrants were detained between 1993 and 1997. And we organized an exhibition in 1996 called Fly to Freedom, where we exhibited these sculptures that they made. I'll get to those soon. But upon learning that I was going to be working on this exhibition, I just wanted to see what was in our exhibition files. And these are some of the materials, and I noticed there's a lot of, there's a specific way that they were, or a particular way they were talking about these migrants. They were using terms like Darwinian like a lot in these articles. But you can kind of see that that's kind of what we had in our archive. It was kind of incomplete. It ended in 1996. So this exhibition gave me a great opportunity to round out that exhibition file for future research and make it easier to recontextualize what was the sculptures today. These are some more materials that I actually gathered through reaching out to the activists who are helping the York County detainees. On the left is a newsletter that they would create once a week. So in addition to having these weekly vigils outside of the prison for 3.5 years, they created these weekly newsletters that had things like announcements for lectures and fundraisers, which is where these sculptures were sold, exhibitions like MoCAs, current events that were happening in China. They often listed all the human rights violations happening over there to help justify their asylum claims. And sometimes there's a little bit of artistic interpretation. And in the center, these are the images of the activists outside of the detention facility. Above, in the center, in the blue garb, there's something really interesting about this story is a lot of people were inspired to, create art within these activist circles. So in the center is a performance artist who I met in New York who still lives there. And she's wearing like a prison uniform and was performing and wrote original music that she would perform at all these vigils as well. And then below is the core group with one of the detainees who was released, actually the first detainee who was released in 1994. Top right, that's some of the men in their prison garb on the day that they were released. It actually really wasn't like a full release. They were paroled, and I'll get into the implications of that soon. And on the bottom right is just a couple of the supporters. The Chinese guy on the right, he goes by ZZ. He was like the cultural liaison and one of the few Chinese people living in New York at the time who they brought in to interpret for a lot of the pro bono attorneys. Another thing to mention is when they arrived in York County, Pennsylvania, this was 1993, there wasn't a single immigration attorney in that town. It's where like the Harley Davidson factory is, and I think other like sort of manufacturing and stuff like that. Also, when I visited, I've never seen so many Trump stickers in my life, but we got along. It was okay. And so I'll first show you like this when talking about the exhibition. I'll eventually get to the exhibition, but this is the brochure, which I have here, and I'll pass around in a bit. But I just want to first talk about the graphic identity a little bit. I asked the designer to do something with text only because there was something about like how language within this narrative kind of opens up these new spaces to discuss like translation or lack of communication or misinterpretation. But also, in my research, I learned a lot of new things about our immigration system, and a lot of them are very secretive, such as these immigrant detention facilities themselves, and the different layers of invisibility of how not just undocumented people are kind of imperiled by our current policies and laws, but anybody who's a non-citizen. And the expansion of grounds to deport people actually happened during their detainment. There wasn't a direct cause and effect between the golden venture migrants and the laws changing in 1996, but they were actually the object within the national debate about how we needed to restrict immigration and strengthen our borders. On the right is, if you fold this out, is basically kind of like an immigrant resource guide. And you guys can pass this around. And it includes, and it's bilingual, it includes not just know your rights information, but a list of direct legal services for immigrants And we made sure to confirm that all the places listed would have Mandarin and Cantonese speakers on staff if they were to call, if somebody was to call. And I opted out of doing like a really lengthy essay and just kind of I did a short reflection of just how the show came together, because I didn't really want to waste too much space, and we had to include all the other institutional information that's just standard in our things. There's a little bit of a dark image, but this is one side of the exhibition. I guess here, maybe I'll just start talking about the design and layout and what it meant. Basically, this is one platform in the gallery space. There are 4 sort of section texts. These are them. But I really wanted people to get a sense of time, so I wanted to create something of like a continuum so that all the sculptures are kind of linked together, but also a way to kind of think about very linearly how the nature of the artistic production shifted over time, because these men were detained for 3.5 years and they never knew when they were going to get out. So you can imagine going to sleep every night not knowing if you're going to be deported and taken out of your cell in the middle of the night, which is very common practice when dealing with undocumented people who are detained. They just try to create this environment of self-deportation and basically an environment of high anxiety and fear for these individuals. Something else to note about them being put into detention is that at the time it was not US policy to detain asylum seekers. Often you would be like sort of detained, but it'd be more of a process. Like within 45 days, you would be out on the street, you'd have a working permit, you can go to your family, go to your community, and just carry out your case that way. This changed with these individuals, and then that policy change was codified in the 1996 Immigration and Anti-Terrorism Acts. You can see here, just in the center, it's like a big banner, freedom. So the activists I was talking about, they go by the name People of the Golden Vision. They were an interfaith immigrant rights group, but more heavily on the Christian side. That is a sign one of the core members made. Actually, the woman who was the only person allowed to go into the prison cells to collect these sculptures. She made that, and it was used every week at the vigils. So I thought it would be really nice to honor her, as well as sort of highlight what's in front of them, which were called the Freedom Birds. And all of these artworks, especially the folded paper ones, are done in a sort of Chinese like folded paper traditional style. But these are a bit more intricate than what you would normally see at homes in China. So these are the 4 sections. So I would say, like, through the title itself, I really wanted to think about the word fold as an action and a metaphor, because when we originally organized this show, there's a different urgency around it, the one in 1996. And that urgency was around getting them out of detention. But with this show, I really wanted to work as hard as I could to recontextualize these pieces, to kind of like to be able to, for people today to be able to relate to them, to be able to understand their story through what's going on right now, and trying to make them relevant in that sense. So above the fold is one section, in the fold, letter folds, and blindfold. I think something I was really trying to pull out of this is with above the fold, which you would read on the right side, that text on the right, I really wanted people to understand the political and social context behind their detainment. And this political and social context had a lot to do with the anti-immigrant sentiment that's happening at the time. So when they landed here in 1993, there were racial tensions because of the LA riots. There was a World Trade Center bombing that year. We were also seeing Haitian refugees arrive by sea. The decade prior, we had the sanctuary movement. So we saw a lot of Central American refugees arriving, a lot of Cuban refugees arriving. So there was definitely like heightened anxiety in the US. I think probably like 61% of the country said they wanted increased restrictions at the time. So that's what above the fold kind of references, and it's like kind of a starting point within the show. But I think of each one of these texts as more of like a lens that you could read at any point. So if one of our visitors was to just doesn't like reading, but will read one thing, hopefully they'll take away something that helps them understand our current situation. And above the fold is more of a, for me, like a response to the present day sort of rhetoric about immigration and policy shifts. Whereas in the fold, is about playing off of this idea of back into the fold, this idiomatic expression, which is very difficult to kind of translate, I think, to Chinese. But I called it in the fold because I was thinking about this community that came together, like how the people of the Golden Vision really helped raise awareness of their story and were responsible for encouraging the production of these sculptures. Letter folds, that's another lens, and it's trying to build off of an idea that Patrick Radden Keefe wrote in his book about the snakeheads and about these sculptures, which is he saw them as a form of prison letter. So I really wanted to play off, develop that idea, but also letter folds being something that reminds you of a form, right? And blindfold, that's in a separate gallery, and that is sort of the section that looks back at the Golden Venture story within a historical context and then updates our visitors as to what the sort of current policies are, as well as what the immigration detention system is, and how a lot of these policies that exist today, which are rooted in the 1996 Immigration Acts, fuel this deportation machine, and what the entanglements are with our private prison industry. So this is that section with above the fold, where I sort of discuss, through the sculptures, the reasons why people were leaving China. A lot of the asylum claims had to do with the one-child policy. That was probably the majority of them, because there was an executive order in the late 80s about that, with a certain number of Chinese asylum seekers can arrive and receive asylum here, which was exploited by the crime syndicates here in Chinatown. So it's not to be so one-sided about it, but that was happening. And the sailboat there to kind of reference their Fujianese sort of seafaring history, as well as other sort of straightforward forms such as the Statue of Liberty, the boat, and the Golden Venture bird cage there. And above them is a photo of Rockaway Beach by a photojournalist, Katja Heinemann, taken in 2013, who came here to study or to photograph Chinatown, but then learned about the Fujianese community, learned about the Golden Venture story, and her having a very strong background in human rights and advocacy, decided that she really wanted to pursue this history, and also sort of uncovered like these entanglements between the immigration detention system and the private prison industry. Something to note about that sculpture, the birdcage on the left, is that on it says Golden Venture. So you could just imagine being one of these detainees where you're in prison, you're watching the television, and there's all these stories about you. And I think that helped develop this sort of cohesive identity around the Golden Venture, kind of subverting this kind of like traumatic experience in a ship and adopting it as their identity. And then to the left of those are these. For me, these are some of the most important pieces, mainly because they weren't created in New York. On the right, that is a note written by a detainee at the Varick Street facility downtown. Detainees there figured out that they can roll up notes, slip them into the air vents, and they would just blow out into the street or outside the cell. And that actually fell at the feet of one of the lead sort of activists from York as she led a demonstration from Transfiguration in Chinatown to Varick Street. And when she handed it to me and donated it to the museum, she said, "This is my most prized possession." In the middle, these are some of the women. So the women had a much different experience than the men in New York. I mean, immigration detention is horrible. The things they do were traumatizing for the men. But the women were lumped in with the general prison population, subjected to many abuses such as solitary confinement, being shackled when they would go to interviews with their attorneys, which the men didn't go through, beaten by the prison guards, beaten by other inmates, and it took them 2 years before somebody acted, and they were transferred to Bakersfield. But that was also a strategy because when you transfer people, they lose all their legal representation. And today, most detainees are transferred multiple times within a year. And a lot of families who arrive are separated and transferred around. So it's even difficult for lawyers to figure out where they are at any given point. And I really like this photo in the bottom center because it has a sculpture. This is a congressional hearing in 1995. So just to emphasize how important these sculptures are to them eventually being released and hopefully like staying in the country. Unfortunately for these women, they did not receive asylum here. In 1995, the Vatican got involved because of this, there's a strong like Christian bent to this activist group, and they found asylum in Ecuador. Within 2 years, they all came back to the U.S. And are currently undocumented. The card on the left was created by one of the female detainees. This card is basically a thank you to one of her supporters in York, because there was a letter exchange sort of happening, like where somebody would be assigned a detainee, and it would help them practice their English, and also like they know somebody to be out there, so if they were to be released, there's somebody to ease that transition and look out for them. But this card arrived with a handwritten letter, basically stating, the only reason why you have this card in your hands is because I gave it to an American inmate who was being released the next day, and they mailed it to you from outside of the prison. So the abuses were so bad at one point that the prison guards denied them letter writing privileges. And their experience is a lot more common for what happens to a detainee today than the men in York. And these beautiful sculptures are a testament to many of the allowances that they were afforded. And one of the things I really tried to bring out of that, or to support that, was looking at a lot of the social relationships that developed both inside and outside of the prison, and using like this idea of the fold to kind of guide that narrative conceptually. Just a better shot of the central display. Often when I do tours for, so often I'm doing tours, I ask children on the tours, does anybody know about sanctuary cities? And of course they're all like, yeah, we know, like we hear about that. And I ask them, what is it? And then we talk about how it's a concept. And I ask them, first I ask them, what does this kind of remind you of, seeing all these animals here? And then we get into the sanctuary city talk. But for me, I really wanted to just have the platform push out because this was the most popular artistic form that was circulating, and very purposefully, because it was an American form that really appealed to American sentimentality. They were in central Pennsylvania, very patriotic part of the country, and that's what sold the most. Here's another section. Just to highlight that central sculpture is each detainee at York contributed at least one folded paper piece to that. And on the outside it says, we sincerely acknowledge your support. So it's a really important sculpture to me that was donated through this show that we didn't know existed, because it's truly a representation of this collective thank you, which was the impetus behind even creating these art forms. Here's a close-up of that, and here's a Life magazine spread in 1996 before their release, just to kind of show, I really want people to see this separation between inside and outside, but I really wanted people to notice the guy in the top left who was a prison guard. I have footage of him clapping and crying the day of their release because they got to know them so well. But here he's very, looking very gruff and kind of mean, and that was completely intentional, just for affect. There's also a video in this room and 2 pagodas. These 2 pagodas for me frame each one of these little clusters in terms of like the communities that were built and with these communal spaces. And in the center is a video from the 1996 exhibit talking about the story and how the art is made, as well as footage of the men on their release date. And I often point to this part of the video for people because his English is really good at this point. on his release date, and that's because of how much time they spent in detention. And then there's another gallery where there's just one sculpture, which you can't really see here, but it's a Buddha-faced Statue of Liberty on top of the U.S. Capitol dome within Chinese city walls. And it was one of the earliest sculptures they made. And I put that in proximity to a video that I put together of excerpts from interviews I conducted with the activists, the attorneys, and other supporters of the migrants, just reflecting back, but also connecting their experience to current day policies and laws. And that's it.
Now we'll have a presentation from our next speaker, Jim.
That's the best part. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Fan. It's really an honor to be here and to give this kind of progress report on my work on the history of Spanish immigration to the United States. As Fan mentioned, I've been obsessing over this for about 10 years now. It's a very small and unknown phenomenon, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, tens of thousands of people from Spain ended up settling in different parts of the U.S. That's a very small number compared to many other groups, but it's not anything to sneeze at either. We're talking about tens of thousands of people who came to the United States and settled in different parts of the country. I'm going to sort of do a really quick synopsis of what I want to say today and then go into some detail. But basically the big story is that I became very interested in this process. I wanted to learn more about the phenomenon of Spaniards in the U.S. And I realized that really the only way to do that was going to be to locate and study family archives, because the history is not documented anywhere else. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much. There's not much scholarship on it. There's not too many records that we can go on, but there are hundreds, thousands of rich family archives with the kinds of materials that will help historians figure out what this experience was like. So the initial idea was to use family archives to reconstruct the history of this small Spanish diaspora to the United States. The diaspora took place 100, 120 years ago, so obviously the protagonists don't live anymore. So we deal with the children, if we're lucky, who are in their 80s and 90s for the most part, and who are the keepers of those family archives. And more we deal with the grandchildren, who also keep the archives. And I say we because, as Fan mentioned, I worked with Luis Argeo, a Spanish writer, journalist, and filmmaker on all of this for the last 5 years. But when we started doing these oral histories of family members and gaining access to family archives, we kind of thought about the children and the grandchildren as just our conduits into the material. We were interested in the archival material and what we could learn from it. But eventually we started becoming really interested in the informants themselves, the children and the grandchildren. And we became especially interested in the ways in which the kinds of things that they often told us were directly contradicted by the things that their archives were telling us. And we started thinking about that because they weren't random contradictions. They weren't, they weren't random. They were systematic and very interesting. And so the project kind of took on a double direction. On the one hand, we continue the project of archiving as best we can the historical circumstances of this original diaspora. At the same time, we try to explore the storytelling process among descendants, children, grandchildren, in some cases great-grandchildren, and to analyze the places where things get distorted or mistaken or wrong. And as I said, more and more I've come to see how those distortions are not aleatory. They're kind of programmatic, and I think they can tell us a lot about a lot of different things. So what I want to do today is to kind of really quickly reconstruct the story that we saw emerging from the family archives, kind of an average trajectory of the Spanish immigrant, a kind of prototypical Spanish immigrant. And then compare that to the kinds of stories that we get frequently from the descendants, and to point out some of the contradictions. I should say that, you know, hovering over this project and over our lives, I think everybody's lives the last few years, has been this, well, the current situation in the country and in the world, and this open question about how a country whose citizens, who have a country that has so many citizens who are so close to immigration, how is it that a country of immigrants, quote unquote, can have such an incredibly strong anti-immigrant strain? How is that possible? How does that happen? And I've come to think that in this research that we've done, kind of without meaning to, we've come up with some partial explanations of how that happens, at least in this community, the community of children and grandchildren of this small sample of Spanish immigrants. Because, and this is really cutting to the chase, one of the questions that I ask always when I do interviews with the descendants is, are there lessons in the experience of your ancestors for immigrants today? It's one of the standard questions that I ask. And I'm gonna, pretty much everything I'm gonna say is gonna be kind of exaggerated to make my point. People say all kinds of things, and I don't wanna, and yeah, but I'm sort of painting a, you know, con brocha gorda a little bit to make my point. But very often the response to that question is one of surprise. It's like, no, the experience of my ancestors has nothing to do with the experience of people today. And then I'll ask them why, and they'll say why, and usually it's all wrong. It's just they have total misconceptions of what their ancestors went through and how they got here and everything else. It's really pretty astounding. And it's right there. They'll bring out the box of documents and photographs, and it's like, well, I'll point out some specific examples, right? But I think this is an important thing to consider, right? How is it that descendants of immigrants are so cruel towards immigrants? Well, if you deny the comparability, if you deny that the experiences are commensurable, well, then you're immune from feeling any kind of empathy or anything. It's like, no, this is completely different. It has nothing to do with it. Okay, so I think it's important to identify the places where the lore deviates from the historical record and analyze that deviation and see where it comes from and what work it's doing. Right? I'll also say, and this was going to be my conclusion, that I've come to be kind of I was optimistic about this discovery, or this, not really discovery, a personal insight, right? That okay, if people lack empathy towards contemporary immigrants because they don't really understand their own immigrant history, the next step is, well, if I explain to them their own immigrant history, I'll fix it. And that's not true either. You can explain people things till they're blue in the face and they're still going to lack empathy, and that's kind of the pessimistic conclusion that I've reached. A lot of times the project has a very active social media presence. We have a Facebook page with 15,000 followers, and we push this agenda occasionally, and the stuff that gets thrown back at us is pretty nasty, often over just an objective fact. Today I posted that the Spaniards who emigrated to Hawaii in 1907 were probably not legal. Or when the ship left Malaga, their legality was not clear. Well, that just drives the descendants crazy, because that's, you know, they've been saying all their lives that my grandparents came here legally. So I want to tell you a little bit about the history of this project, and again, I'd like to get to the point where I juxtapose what I hear the archives saying and what I hear the descendants saying. This is a caricature from the years of when the quotas were established in the early 1920s. You know, and descendants of Spaniards are often surprised to see that their country was considered a shithole in 1921. There's a congressman from Norway, a congressman from Minnesota who was born in Norway, who got up on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1920 and said, "Spain is a seething mess of anarchy, and the Spanish government is gathering these anarchists and dumping them on us." It's exactly the rhetoric of our president. They're not sending us their best, right? There's a country that's actually gathering people up and sending them. Spain was a shithole, and immigration after the quotas was reduced. I think in 1923, the Spanish quota was 121. Okay. In 1917, about 100,000 Spaniards entered the U.S. That's the highest year. World War I created a lot of job opportunities. Spain was neutral. There were factory jobs. So in 1917, 100,000 Spaniards entered the U.S. legally. Or, yeah, we can question the word legally, but without problems. And 4 years later, the number of people that could legally enter from Spain had been reduced to 121,000 as part of this project of shaping the pool of people coming into the country. So I started working on this project kind of by accident when in 2007 I worked on this museum exhibition called Facing Fascism, New York and the Spanish Civil War. And I co-edited the catalog, and I assigned myself an essay that seemed like a no-brainer. This catalog about the Spanish Civil War in New York has to have a chapter on how Spaniards and Latinos in New York saw the war, how they lived through it, what they did, how they experienced it. And so like a good scholar, I went to the library and said, oh, let's get the bibliography on this. And there was none. None, zero. There was an article at the time on Irish Americans in the Spanish Civil War, African Americans in the Spanish Civil War, Jewish Americans in the Spanish Civil War, Italian Americans in the Spanish Civil War, and not a word about Spanish Americans or Latinos more generally. So I had to do two things. I had my, a self-imposed deadline to get this catalog essay done. So I did two things. One was to dive into the Spanish language press of the 1930s, which is quite rich in the U.S. and in New York. There were two Spanish language dailies coming out in the war years, La Prensa, which had been running since the teens, and La Voz, which was created for the war. So I dove into the Spanish language press, and I started interviewing old-timers, New Yorkers, who had first-hand memories of the 30s and of the Spanish Civil War. So this was 10 years ago. These are the folks that were now in their 80s and 90s. They were in their 70s and 80s then. And that's where I started doing oral histories. I had bought a video camera at the time. I started filming those video histories, those oral histories. And I also started digitizing just photographs that had to do with the Spanish Civil War. But I started going into people's houses and taking their stuff, digitizing it. And that was kind of the start of this whole enterprise. In the press of the time, I kept coming across these lists of Spanish clubs, committees, centers, organizations that were raising money to send to support the Spanish Republic. In fact, they had all confederated under the umbrella of an organization called the Sociedades Hispanas Confederadas to kind of coordinate the fundraising efforts on behalf of the Republic. And I was blown away by the amount of organizations and the spread, the geographical spread. I knew that there were Spaniards in New York. I knew that there were Basques in Idaho. I knew that the Gallegos in Newark. I had heard about people in Tampa. I mean, I had a spotty knowledge of the presence of Spanish immigrants in the U.S. But these lists reveal a much larger and more widespread population. And so I actually used these lists to make a map and to figure out, okay, why is there a Club Español in Helen, West Virginia, or in Barry, Vermont? Why are there enough Spaniards together to form a club and then have that club join an umbrella organization and then send money to the Republic? And so using that list and using word of mouth, and there is a small and very helpful bibliography on the subject. There's a 1992 book by Germán Rueda called Españoles en Estados Unidos, a valiant attempt to kind of piece this story together, but done before internet, when you couldn't do Ellis Island searches, in your pajamas. It's a great effort, but it was done in 1992. But using the scholarship that was there, new digital resources that have come online, and especially just calling people and actually using social media to connect with people in a lot of these towns, we eventually, Luis and I, made a map of the enclaves that we were interested in. This map is in the book that Fawn mentioned, the Invisible Immigrants, Spanish immigrants in the U.S. And so we've, with the exception of the Basque enclaves, which are the ones in the mountain states represented by sheep, because most of them were shepherds, we've been to all of them to conduct research and to archive, digitize family archives. We haven't done the Basque diaspora because it's really pretty well studied compared to the other stories. The Basque story is quite well documented, and it is part of the same story, I would argue, but we've kind of put it on the back burner. But we've been all over the country. We've done hundreds now of oral histories and digitized scores of family archives, and produced this book of photographs scanned from those family archives. In the book, we take all of the information that we gathered in the archives from the family stories, and as I said before, we try to put together this kind of average portrait based again on our best understanding of the historical record. And we organize the photographs into 6 chapters, and each chapter corresponds to a sentence of the story, and the story is the one that you have there. In a time of great upheavals among millions of other European immigrants, they were but a drop in the bucket. They arrived and spread out all over the country in search of opportunities. Together they laughed and cried, together they lived and loved. They got organized, rallied behind a cause that lost. They were here to stay. And so each of the chapters, using photographs and captions, as little word as possible. We did our best to make this a book where the weight falls on the images. But we did trace that kind of narrative arc for this story. So again, there's our best shot at a, like the scientists do with all these data points to draw the line that more or less averages the data points. That's our best shot. I should say that this is a story, an average story of those Spaniards, obviously, who stayed in the U.S. and who had descendants, because our sources are descendants. There's a lot of Spaniards that went back to Spain. When the Second Republic came in 1931 and the United States was in the midst of the horrible Depression, many Spaniards chose to go back to Spain. Many of them went back to Spain to die in the Spanish Civil War, sadly enough. But that's another story. So here's the average story that we discern from our archival dives. I guess I'll just use the story that I'm creating, kind of distorted third generation story, to highlight some of the main points of what I consider the more or less accurate story. This is something that we get almost all the time. And I should also say that my grandparents were from Spain. So a lot of this stuff actually, as I learned it, I was sort of relearning it. And a lot of it I experienced in my own family history. My father's parents came from Spain in the early 20th century. And I never thought that was something that was interesting or worthy of study, or that it was even something that had ever happened to anyone else. I just thought it was like a one-off thing. I had all kinds of information that told me that was not true. Like I would say, oh, my grandparents met at a picnic organized by the Centro Asturiano of New York. I would say that, and then I would say, but their story is unique. Say, no, wait a minute, Or they didn't know anyone when they got here. How did they not know anyone? Anyway, this I'm going to call it the assimilated story, because the point that I want to make is that assimilation carries with it a whole bunch of things, including ways of telling stories and ways of framing stories. And what I'm going to sketch in yellow is kind of this extreme version of the assimilated story. And I think you'll see, as I put up the different elements, I hope you'll see how they contrast with what the historical record seems to indicate. Right? So these are stories of self-made men and women who came by themselves and received no help from nobody. Okay? No help from nobody, no help from anybody. Any help from anybody. I think it's important to compare that sentence, that expression, with what we see reflected in the historical record, but also, and I sense this in a very real way, conducting the interviews, that a lot of times, because the question was, does your ancestor's story have any lessons for contemporary immigrants? A lot of times what we're getting are kind of colazos or barbs, punches at contemporary immigrants. Right? So they're saying they came alone, nobody helped them. ... Unlike those that come today that come in gangs and take government subsidies. Right? This sort of this unspoken, sometimes not even unspoken, right? Comparison. Again, highlighting this incommensurability, the incomparability of the two experiences, which is what I think short circuits any kind of empathy. This is a huge one, and it's almost always wrong. Did your grandparents come here to make some money and go back to Spain, or did they come to stay? Oh no, they came to stay. No question about it. And then, you read the family archives, it's full of letters that the descendants often can't read because they're in Spanish. Or you just look at the history, the chronology of the naturalization of these people. It's like someone say, oh no, my grandmother came here to become American. So, well, your grandmother arrived in 1913, and here's her naturalization papers. She became a citizen in 1940. And every year between 1913 and 1940, you've got a paper in your archive showing how she went to the consulate in San Francisco to renew her status as a Spanish resident in San Francisco in case she needed services or if she wanted to go back to Spain. So you say that she came here, cut all ties, and knew she was going to stay. Your archive says something else. Or letters talking openly about, is it time to go back now? How are things in Spain? Maybe now, when the Republic comes in, maybe this is a good moment for us to go back. But there's a strong investment in this assimilated narrative to claim that our ancestors didn't come hedging bets or come to test the waters. They came because in the cradle in Galicia, they were proto-Americans. They were born, destined to become patriotic American citizens, and therefore it's very uncomfortable to say, actually, your grandfather was hedging his bets. And again, they tell these stories that make it so clear, case after case, where an informant will say, can I get another bottle of water? I'm getting water. Thank you. Informants will say that, thanks so much.
No problem.
My grandfather came to New York, but his brother went to Havana, and his other brother went to Buenos Aires. It's like, well, okay, well, there's proof, right, that these people were hedging their bets. They were looking for opportunity. I mean, right? There was not some kind of manifest destiny at birth. Right? This is a huge one, and again, think about not only the contrast to what the historical record might say, but also the implicit contrast toward the contemporary immigrant that's operating here. My grandparents came here legally, and they abided by the law. Like I pointed out in this post that I did today, and it was recently pointed out by the director of the Tenement Museum, right? The people say this so flippantly, our ancestors came legally. So what exactly does that mean, right? I mean, before the 1920s, there aren't really any laws to talk about unless you were Chinese, right? And so let's say that they came illegally. That drives people crazy. Well, if there weren't any laws, they didn't break them, so they came legally. You say, well, okay. You know. But my grandparents came legally, and we'll say, okay, let's unpack that. In most cases, if they were men and they were coming from Spain, they were avoiding the draft in Spain and breaking Spanish law. I mean, the vast majority of these guys were draft evaders. That's well documented. So well documented that when Primo de Rivera instituted a program to try to recoup some of the young men who had left the country, he offered amnesty a program of amnesty to those who had left without fulfilling their military service. Okay? They'll contradict themselves. They'll say they came legally and obeyed the law, and then 5 minutes later they'll be telling you a story about how they made the best wine in all of Alameda County during Prohibition. So, well, what's it going to be? They were law-abiding or they were bootleggers. It's one or the other. Seriously. And they'll tell stories of pretty picaresque adventures of their ancestors without ever associating it with criminality or delinquency. It's more pluckiness and ingenuity, and they were self-made. It's like, yeah, they were outlaws, But no, so what's picturesque and picaresque 100 years ago today is sinister and criminal and delinquent. They love this country. Very strong sentiment expressed with a lot of fervor, very often. And very often, again, the last thing I want to do is to call into question, people's beliefs or loyalties or whatever. But the family archives often really nuance this statement. What I learned from the family archives, usually when it's an archive of an assimilated descendant, is that they learned to love the country. They underwent a series of experiences that led them to say that they love the country. Some of those experiences, ironically, are terrible, like losing a child in World War II or in the Korean War. Paradoxically, that actually makes people love this country, because how horrible would it be to not love the country if you gave your kid to it, right? There's a whole lot of complex things going on there. But again, lots and lots of evidence. Not that they hated the country, although there's some evidence of that too. We found in Canton, Ohio, in the archive of a big Trump supporter, we found this Ellis Island diary of his grandfather, where he just trashes the country. He was detained on the island for some reason. Says, this piece of shit country. They talk like, he makes fun of the English, and it's ridiculous. And anyway, so they love the country. So my idea is, the way we did this picture book, using the story on the left to structure the narrative, I'm now writing a book in prose where each one of these sentences is a chapter, where I try to use examples and anecdotes from the archive to flesh these out.
Sorry, I was signaling to Andrew if you want to move away.
Thank you. I'm almost done. Were your ancestors victims of discrimination or prejudice? No. My ancestors were from Spain. Like, oh, excuse me. There's this belief, especially the further you get away from the original immigrants, that your self-perception of your prestige, you think you're prestigious because you think of yourself as European, but an American racist in 1910 didn't really care if you were from Murcia or Monterrey. I mean, it was, there was a system of privilege that the Spaniards tapped into. There's no question about it. And that I've come to see we need to look at region by region. So in Tampa, it's different from New York, and New York is different from California. Not to say that the Spaniards didn't enjoy any form of privilege, but they certainly suffered discrimination and prejudice. And it's evidenced in the archive and in family stories, and yet the descendants typically play it down. Or deny it, in fact. And the last one, for me, is probably the most interesting. It could be a book unto itself, because there is this common sentiment that our ancestors were too busy working to be political. They weren't interested in politics. They were all about self-promotion, self-reliability, self-madeness. And we get this story over and over again. And the family archives are just encyclopedias of collective action, especially when the Spanish Civil War breaks out, but even before. So throughout the 1920s, the Spaniards, like other ethnic groups in a pre-New Deal America with no social services, banded together and formed these social aid societies, mutual aid societies, and had their own health insurance and their own hospitalization, their own funeral benefits and all of that. When the Depression hit, those organizations became even more important and became even stronger. And then when the Spanish Civil War broke out in July of 1936, the Spanish immigrant community was kind of at its peak in terms of cohesion. These societies were strong and numerous and functioning. And within a couple of weeks, those organizations could turn on a dime from doing soccer matches to raise money for the party into doing soccer matches to raise money to buy an ambulance for the Republic. Right? And so that long list of organizations sending money to the Republic is actually kind of the evolution of these social organizations that have been put in place for mutual support throughout the 20s and into the 1930s. Almost every family archive is full of rich documentation of how the Spanish enclaves all over the U.S. mobilized on behalf of the Spanish Republic. And yet these documents are invisible mostly to the descendants, especially if it's the grandchildren. They don't, they'll show you a picture of 200 people. This is an actual example. This panoramic photograph about this long of a picnic in Monterey, California, about 200 people in it. And each person that sees it, each grandchild that sees it, just sees two people, the grandparents. Say, oh, that's my grandpa. Yeah, well, who are the other 198 people? Oh, I don't know. Right? It's illegible to them. And the collective enterprise that their ancestors participated in and benefited from is pretty much erased by this assimilated narrative. The irony is that in many cases that we've documented, it was actually the Spanish Civil War that slammed the door shut on the dream or hope to ever return back to Spain. So what we see often in family archives is that these are Spaniards who are here hedging their bets, sending money back to Spain, hoping that things will get better here, but also better enough in Spain to go back home. And then the country is thrown into this disastrous civil war that lasts 3 years and ends with a fascist dictatorship in power, when you've been mobilizing here on behalf of the Republic. So ironically, these assimilated descendants who tell this assimilated narrative of the apolitical nature of their ancestors' stories are actually here because of, in part, the Spanish Civil War and the behavior of their ancestors during the Spanish Civil War, because it would have been a death sentence for many of them to go back to Spain. We have a couple of cases of Spaniards who get in trouble with the law here in the early 1940s and are deported to Spain only to be executed for their, not for the crime that they did here, but for being Republican supporters. I'll finish with this juxtaposition. There's the Spanish community of Canton, Ohio. There's a family there who preserved the programs of the summer picnic, the annual summer picnic held by the Canton's Spanish community. They have every program from 1935 to 1970, I think. And the programs are gold mines of information. These older ones from the 30s and 40s are 32 pages. So there's all kinds of illustrations and jokes and speeches and ads. You can reconstruct Spanish business-scape in Canton, Ohio from these programs. But in the book, we put this spread out towards the end of the book in the chapter about assimilation, actually, because I think the juxtaposition tells the same story that I'm trying to tell you now. Only 9 years, right, lapse between the community that produced the pamphlet on the right and the community that on the left and the community that produced the one on the right. In theory, this is the same community. But you just have to look at these two to realize that something traumatic has happened between one and the other. Something very big has happened between one and the other. I would say, to the extent even that the community on the left has probably become illegible to the community that produced the document on the right. Maybe kind of overstating things, but just as a heuristic. The program on the left was produced by a Spanish-speaking community with its heart and mind and eyes in Spain, clearly. This is produced in the midst of the Spanish Civil War. And their annual picnic was devoted to raising funds for the Spanish Republic. And look what we get 9 years later from the same annual event, right? It's this idyllic American family marching into the future in English with this whole other graphic universe, right? This whole other imaginary and imagined universe. And yeah, and I'll just close again by repeating that I think that the assimilation represented by the illustration on the right in some ways renders invisible or makes illegible the history of communities like the one that's represented on the left. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And now we will have JP give this presentation.
Thank you, Fan, and thank you, Alejandra, and thanks to my two colleagues for their great presentations today, super fascinating talks. Thanks to all of you for coming here, sticking with us through this evening. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm not going to be nearly as polished as James and Andrew, and I'll try to keep it short because there's food on the table getting cold and there's wine to be drunk. I actually have never seen such self-discipline when human beings are close to intoxicating elements. In fact, I'm going to pour a glass of wine. Okay, so let's go to the Sonoran Desert. How did we get there, Josh Bonetta and myself? So Josh Bonetta is a Canadian artist who specializes in mostly celluloid film, multi-channel installation, and sound art. He's worked a lot in has this beautiful piece called Strange Lines and Distances about the Marconi radio transmission between Cornwall, England, and Newfoundland and Canada. He's made films called American Color, where he's traveling across the United States with this last piece of 60mm film that Kodak produced to see if he can film America's identity and have it developed in one spot in, I believe, Kansas it was. And I've mostly worked in China, as I said, with the lone exception of foreign parts. Most of my films have been there. But we were both in Ithaca at the same time and thought we'd like to work together. And our original idea was to follow in the footsteps of Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave Beaumont, the lesser known of the pair, the two French youngsters. I think they were in their 20s. They came over here to ostensibly study prison culture and prison system in the United States, but instead gave these kind of amazing sociological, political economy surveys of America, the fledgling democratic country that this supposedly was. And so we started in their footsteps, traveling on one leg of the journey. When we got to New Orleans, this was the summer of 2014 or 15, I believe. I had a residency in Headlands in Marin County outside of San Francisco, so we just drove west. We're going to pick up the second and the third leg of Gustave Beaumont and Alexis de Tocqueville's journey later down the road. So we started driving west, and we wanted to go to Marfa, so we're in West Texas. And as you get closer to the border with Mexico, the border kind of starts to pull you in like a tractor beam. You know, you see Border Patrol, you see particular signage, you notice a sort of change in the way that people speak about those issues. And so being the curious Yankees that we were, we went down there to take a look. And the border did start to find a way to call to us as a sort of focus for us. So we came in with no intention to make a film about immigration or about the desert or about the border. This was 2014. But because of the encounters we had with Border Patrol, with people who lived on both sides of the border, with ranchers, with cowboys, with activists, with Samaritans, with vigilantes, we got really interested. And so we started to film along certain towns, following from Texas to New Mexico, to Arizona, to California, and then we went to California, to Headlands, looked at some of our footage, and started to think about how we might approach this. We did some research, and we found this fantastic anthropologist, maybe you know him, Jason De Leon. He just won a MacArthur Genius Award at the University of Michigan. He wrote a very polemical ethnography called The Land of Open Graves. specifically about the Sonoran Desert, Sonora, Mexico, and Arizona, the southern Arizona. And that's the location that the Sonoran Desert really called out to us. Of all the sort of ecologies that we traversed, this was the one that really captivated our cinematic sensibility, and it just so happened to be the focus of his book as well. And it, Sonoran Desert still has activity, but it's not the hot spot. If you talk to Border Patrol, the hot spot is like McAllen down in southern Texas and those areas. But still, it's been a site of a massive amount of life lost, and a lot of throughout history, right? And not just in this sort of late 20th century, late 21st century, but throughout history. But especially since, as Jason argues very well in his book, prevention through deterrence. You guys ever hear of that policy, whereby the border patrol beefs up security in places that are easy to cross, like Juarez, El Paso, and so it sort of funnels people into natural locations, into very rugged terrains like the Sonoran Desert. In the Sonoran Desert, it's called prevention through deterrence because who wants to walk through the Sonoran Desert for days and days on end? Often these are people from different parts of Central America or everywhere across Mexico who are coming, and they've never seen a desert before. So it's a way of sort of outsourcing the lethality or the sort of the lethal discipline and regulation of the border to a natural feature of the landscape, kind of like what happens in Europe, right, and with the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, Europe has their response to it, but the U.S. way of dealing with this is to sort of have the desert, deliver the justice, deliver the punishment, and then erase the evidence as much as possible through the sort of brutal sun and the way in which things desiccate in the desert. And Jason talks about this quite graphically, quite powerfully in his book. I recommend if you haven't read it, take a look at it. And we started to become closer with him, and he said you should go to Arivaca, which is this town where he based a lot of his work, the undocumented migrant project he does. And so we went down there, and it's a cross-section of a lot of the different actors and forces. So we hiked with Samaritans, bringing water and food. We spent time with vigilantes and understood their ideology. We talked a lot with Border Patrol. We talked a lot with people at the one bar in Arivaca, which is kind of like you ever see Star Wars, the cantina in Star Wars? It's kind of like that. It's like a revolving area of different characters. But, I don't think there's any laser gun shootouts there. So we began to focus in that area and filming over the next couple of years, spending months at a time there shooting. And in the end, we finished this film called El Mar La Mar, which the name comes from the idea that if you arrive at the desert and you're uninitiated to the desert, if you're a foreigner like we are, like someone from Jalisco or something, you're going to be like lost at sea. It's going to be a lot of noise instead of being able to sort of discern the landscape. The other thing is that we were thinking, of course, about the Mediterranean in that situation while we were making El Mar La Mar. And so we're trying to draw a parallel to that. And then El Mar La Mar is one of those wonderful Spanish words that can be constructed both in terms of feminine and masculine. And so we like the way in which that calls attention to things that are boundaries or borders or dichotomies between states of being, that also sort of problematizes, brings them to attention, and we were hoping that it somehow destabilizes those distinctions. Then, of course, there's the poem El Mar La Mar by Rafael Alberti that maybe you guys have. This is a Spanish Portuguese department. I'm sure some of you have read it before. And so that was some of the impetus behind the title of this film. The film itself is, I guess, it's just been written about in some reviews because it's going to, as I said, show at MoMA starting tomorrow for a week. It's been out for over a year now, but it's having its theatrical release. I invite you all to come on Friday. It's free. If you can't go on Friday, Fanfan, Alejandra, they have my email. I can get you comp tickets for other days during the week. But not for all your family and friends, maybe just for a few people. We'll see how much pull I have at MoMA. But we filmed it in a way that's unlike a lot of, I guess this is what people say, unlike a lot of the ways in which these questions have been approached, although I think it does have some connection to a lot of photography that's been going on in that region that sort of documents the traces and the residue of folks who have passed through that area or people who have lived in that area. And so it's more about trying to find a way to get at this Sonoran ecology that does have all of these various kinds of dramas, tragedies, and politics traversing it. So I don't want to take up a lot of time because, like I said, we should eat, but maybe we'll watch the first, or watch like maybe 5-10 minutes of it, somewhere like in the first 15 minutes of the film, if I can find it on the Vimeo here. And please, if you're interested, come see it where it's actually in 5.1 sound and good, projection. Not that this is, not fine projection, but do we have sound? How do we determine that? And can we kill the lights too? Thank you. Just like crank it.
Okay.
I don't think we'll blow out the speakers. This is in a very basic section. I'm not running it yet.
Okay, you can.
Okay, can you turn it up?
Es un silencio aterrador. Lo único que escuchas son como tus pisadas de la arena, pero es algo como sordo, como hueco. O el ruido que vas haciendo con tus cosas que llevas, o si la gente habla, pero te dicen más. Casi todo el tiempo te piden más bien que no hables, porque te vas a cansar más. Entonces empezamos a caminar. No tardó mucho, alguien se desmayó, una persona grande, un señor ya grande, y por eso es que nos quedamos con él, nos quedamos 4 personas con él, ayudarlo a seguir caminando, pero teníamos que ir siguiendo las huellas de ellos. Pero desafortunadamente hay mucho viento. Llega un momento en que las huellas ya es casi imposible verlas. Entonces nos hace caminar como 2 horas hacia nuestra izquierda. Y vamos llegando otra vez a zonas rocosas, arbustos, o sea, ya no era... Como que empezamos a llegar a la orilla del desierto. Pero ahí nos ve otra patrulla, no sé cómo, pero el chiste es que oímos los ruidos de los jeeps y nos dice que nos escondamos. Creo que para esto eran las 6 de la tarde ya. Y nos escondemos, igual otra vez nos empiezan a buscar, saben que estamos ahí, ya saben que... La verdad, en ese momento estoy escondido, pero me quedo dormido. Despierto tiempo después, pero cuando despierto ya no hay nadie. No están ni los que estaban conmigo, ni siquiera el señor. Entonces me levanto y pues lo que se me ocurre es caminar hacia el frente. Una cosa tiene el desierto que puedes mirar, porque si alguien viene puedes verlo a muchas millas. Para esto ya era noche. No sé cuántas horas estoy caminando, pegado a unas casas que no sé de quiénes eran, pero... Y encuentro una patrulla que está levantando a unas 15, 20 personas, las están subiendo en camiones, en camionetas. Pero soy una sola persona, en lo oscuro no me ven. Yo sí los veo porque ya llevo mucho tiempo en la oscuridad, ya mis ojos ya se acostumbraron, yo pienso eso. El desierto es como de día, en la noche. En el desierto tu cielo es un techo de luz. O sea, de noche tú puedes ver el reflejo de la luna y las estrellas con la arena. Es un cuarto iluminado. No te pierdes porque no veas, te pierdes porque no sabes dónde estás.
Okay, we can stop there. And instead of, I was thinking about showing you more scenes, but maybe because of the time, we should just move on to what the next idea of the evening would be, which I thought was maybe questions and food. Food and questions,
We'll
wine,
have
food.
a Q&A first.
So we can, since it's